She was just a secretary, until she challenged everything he thought he knew. What would you do if life took everything you loved, your career, your security, even your mother, and left you standing in the cold with nothing but debt and a fading dream? Charlotte Hayes didn't ask for a second chance. She just needed a job. But when she stepped into the glass towers of Lockridge Enterprises, she didn't expect to meet a man like Graham Lockridge, powerful, untouchable, and quietly broken in ways she would soon recognize all too well. This isn't a love story in the usual sense. It's a story about two people who had every reason to stay guarded, and yet, somehow, chose not to. A story of grief, dignity, vulnerability, and the unexpected healing that begins with simply being seen. If you've ever felt invisible, replaceable, or like your story was too small to matter, this is for you. Let us know in the comments, have you ever walked away from something that almost broke you? Now, take a deep breath, and let's begin. What do you do when everything you've built comes crashing down and you still have to get up and go to work? Charlotte Hayes had once believed in the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Lesson plans, morning coffee, little notes from second graders scribbled in crayon. It was a quiet sort of joy, the kind that didn't ask for applause. She had been a teacher for nearly 12 years until life, in its sharp and unapologetic way, reminded her that security could vanish in a blink. It started with a cough dry, persistent, innocent at first. Her mother had brushed it off. Just allergies, she said. But within weeks, it spiraled into something far more cruel, a rare pulmonary disease, aggressive and unforgiving. 2 years of treatment, trial medications, and late-night ambulance rides followed. Insurance covered the basics, but the rest that came from Charlotte's savings, her second job tutoring on weekends, and eventually, credit cards she swore she'd never open. When her mother passed away on a cloudy February morning, the silence that filled the apartment wasn't just grief. It was the echo of everything Charlotte had lost along the way. Her mother, her home, her identity. She lasted 3 more months at the school. The children's laughter, once the highlight of her day, started to sound like noise through water. The fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly. The smell of dry erase markers turned her stomach. Mostly, it was the guilt, standing in front of bright-eyed children, asking them to believe in a future when hers felt like a door closed too soon. So, she left. No dramatic goodbye, just a quiet resignation letter, neatly folded, handed to the principal with a weary smile. Now, 6 months later, Charlotte was no longer Miss Hayes, the beloved teacher. She was simply Charlotte 36, unemployed, and drowning in medical debt. The woman who had once prided herself on being prepared now counted coins at the grocery store and prayed her old sedan would make it 1 more week without a warning light. It was Mrs. Lee from her mother's church group who first mentioned the temp agency. "They're always looking for office people," the older woman said gently, stirring sugar into her tea. "It's not teaching, honey, but it's honest work." Charlotte smiled, nodded, and filled out the application the next day. 2 weeks later, she stood in front of a building that looked more like a monument than an office. Lockridge Enterprises, 68 floors of glass and steel piercing the Seattle skyline like it belonged to another world entirely. The morning air was crisp, smelling faintly of sea salt and asphalt. Charlotte's fingers curled tightly around the manila folder she held inside, her resume. 2 letters of recommendation, and the last remnants of who she had been. She was early. Of course she was. Old habits from teaching died hard. She watched the people who passed her polished shoes clicking across pavement, tailored suits, sleek hair pulled into purposeful buns. Everyone here moved like they had somewhere important to be, like they belonged. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored lobby doors. Same hazel eyes, same auburn hair tied back in a low twist. But her posture was different now. There was a tiredness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before, a kind of quiet resilience carved by grief and necessity. Her outfit, a navy blouse and knee-length gray skirt, was carefully chosen from the few office-appropriate pieces she still owned. It wasn't fashionable, but it was clean and pressed. Her heels were modest, her lipstick subtle. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the entrance. The doors opened with a whisper, and the lobby greeted her with cold marble, towering ceilings, and the faint scent of eucalyptus and success. It was the kind of place where even silence felt expensive. A security guard directed her to the reception desk, where a young woman with a headset greeted her with a practiced smile. Charlotte Hayes. She asked, "Yes, you're here to meet with HR, 18th floor. Take the elevator to your right." Charlotte nodded, muttered a thank you, and moved as if walking through someone else's life. In the elevator, she stared at the ascending numbers. The higher they climbed, the tighter her chest felt. 18th floor, executive temp placement, Lockridge Enterprises. She knew little about the company beyond the basics: biotech, clinical trials, innovation in healthcare. The irony wasn't lost on her after everything her mother endured. Charlotte would now be working for a company that promised to improve lives through science. A chime signaled her arrival. The doors opened onto a floor, bathed in soft, natural light and quiet efficiency. A receptionist ushered her to a waiting area. "They'll be with you shortly." Charlotte sat down, placed the folder neatly in her lap, and tried to steady her breathing. She folded her hands, unfolded them, smoothed her skirt, checked her watch. Still early. She thought about her mother, about the mornings they used to sit on the porch with steaming mugs of tea, watching the mist roll off the trees. Her mother always believed in starting fresh, no matter how hard the night before had been. "Charlotte, sweetheart," she used to say. "Even rock bottom is a foundation." Today, Charlotte wasn't sure if she believed that, but she was here, dressed, present, upright. That had to count for something. She looked out the tall window at the city stretching beyond. From this height, even the traffic seemed small, manageable, almost quiet. She had no way of knowing what waited for her in that building, what kind of man she would meet, what kind of past he carried, what kind of future her presence would ignite. But as the door opened and a voice called her name, Charlotte stood, back straight, shoulders steady. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to collide with a man who had everything, except what she carried inside. Behind the steel and glass, there are people hiding from pain. Sometimes, they're just better at pretending than others. The hallway leading to the executive wing of Lockridge Enterprises felt like a different universe, quieter, colder, and somehow more watchful. Charlotte could hear the soft pad of her heels on the carpeted floor, a lonely rhythm that echoed louder in her head than in the space around her. The receptionist who led her there spoke in hushed tones and walked briskly, not bothering to make eye contact. Everyone here seemed to move like they were on invisible tracks, programmed and precise, like a machine that would hiccup if someone paused too long. At the end of the corridor stood a glass door with brushed steel framing, no nameplate, just the sleek, minimalist logo of Lockridge Enterprises etched into the glass like a brand. The woman pressed a discreet button near the handle and said, "You may go in now. Mr. Lockridge is expecting you." Charlotte nodded, swallowed quietly, and entered. The office was a cathedral of glass and light. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled sunshine across polished concrete floors and minimalist furniture. A single abstract painting hung on the far wall, all jagged lines and deep reds. The room had no warmth, only order. Behind a wide desk sat a man with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, staring intently at a digital tablet. He didn't look up. For a moment, Charlotte wondered if he hadn't heard the door, but then he spoke, his voice even, clipped, and perfectly modulated. "You're late." She blinked. "No, sir. I was here 15 minutes early. Your front desk had me wait until they could confirm your schedule." He didn't look up. "It's 9:04. It is. I arrived at 8:45. I waited as instructed." The air in the room shifted just slightly. Charlotte stood still, both hands resting on the manila folder she'd carried in. Finally. He looked up. Graham Lockridge had the kind of presence that filled a room even when he didn't speak. His hair was a salt and pepper blend, neatly combed back, but slightly tousled like he'd run a hand through it one too many times. His jawline was strong, set like marble, but it was his eyes that caught her off guard, cool steel gray, sharp and analytical, like they saw not just a person, but their sum total intent, weakness, history. He studied her for a long moment. Charlotte didn't drop her gaze. "You're Charlotte Hayes," he said finally. "Yes. Temporary placement from Halstead Staffing." "That's right. You taught second grade for over a decade." "I did. Why leave education for administration?" "My circumstances changed. The silence that followed was more than awkward. It was deliberate, like he wanted to see what she'd do with it. She didn't rush to fill it. She'd dealt with classroom silence before. She simply stood, patient, composed. Graham leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "I don't particularly like turnover," he said. "I'm not particularly fond of chaos," Charlotte replied, gently. "So, that makes two of us." There it was, a flicker, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like a pause in his mask. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Charlotte did. The leather was cold against the backs of her legs. The entire space felt designed to intimidate, sparse, imposing, a reflection of the man who occupied it. He scanned her resume for a few seconds. "Your qualifications exceed what this position demands. I understand that, so why accept it? Because sometimes the right job isn't the one that matches your degree. It's the one that pays the rent." His eyes narrowed, just slightly. "You're direct. I've taught 30 children to tie their shoes before the bell rang. I don't have time for anything else." Another flicker. That same nearly there reaction. It passed quickly. He put down the tablet. "Do you know what we do here? Biotech, clinical trials. You're known for research on autoimmune disorders. That's the public summary." She waited. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he stood tall, lean, every movement precise. He walked to the window and stared out across the city. "I don't run this company with patience," he said, almost to the glass. "I run it with results. I expect people to be punctual, efficient, disciplined." Charlotte remained seated, watching him but not staring, listening. "I am all those things," she said, her voice steady. "And I don't like being misjudged." That made him turn. His expression wasn't angry. It was curious, as if she'd just spoken in a language he hadn't heard in years. Charlotte didn't flinch. She'd spent years looking into the eyes of children who challenged her every day. This man, he was no different, just older and maybe lonelier. Graham walked back to his desk and picked up a folder. "This is the confidentiality agreement. If you accept the role, you'll sign it. If not, we're done here." Charlotte opened the folder, scanned the document quickly, and reached for the pen. "I'm not here to waste your time, Mr. Lockridge," she said as she signed. "I'm here to work." He took the folder from her hands and glanced at her signature. Something shifted in his eyes. He didn't fire her. That was unexpected, but more unexpected was how she made him feel something other than control. Sometimes, the most powerful conversations happen in silence. The first week passed in quiet observation. Charlotte had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words, especially with children. They fidgeted, sighed, stared out the window, or twisted their shoelaces in knots, telling her far more than they ever said aloud. Now, as she stepped into the sterile hum of the executive suite each morning, she found herself using that same muscle again. Graham Lockridge didn't speak more than necessary. He gave instructions like checklists, measured and precise. There was no small talk, no good mornings, no inquiries about how her weekend had been. He didn't offer praise. He didn't offer criticism either, just tasks, delivered clearly, expected to be done. But it was everything he didn't say that Charlotte paid attention to. The way he tapped his pen twice before setting it down. The fact that he preferred paper copies of reports, not digital. That he always turned his chair slightly away from the window before taking a call, as if facing the city too directly unsettled him. She began to learn his patterns. He arrived at the office just after 6:30, and every day before the cleaning staff had even finished their rounds. He left well after sunset, often with a stack of files tucked under one arm, and a look that suggested sleep was optional. He didn't eat. At first, Charlotte thought maybe she'd missed it. Maybe he had something delivered to the private break room, or kept a stash of protein bars in his drawer. But by Thursday, she was sure. She watched the minutes tick by from noon to 2, and Graham never moved, never paused. Coffee, yes, always black, always freshly brewed from the machine he insisted be kept in his office. But food. It was as if the man had no need for it. On Friday, she came in with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper from a small deli near her apartment, 1 ham and Swiss, 1 turkey and cranberry just in case he had a preference. At exactly 12:10, when she knew he wasn't on a call, she knocked once and stepped in. He glanced up from his desk, pen poised over a printed spreadsheet. "I brought lunch," she said gently, holding out the paper bag. "You've been skipping it all week. I don't take lunch. I've noticed." A beat of silence. Then, "That's unnecessary." "I know," she replied, "but so is working 16 hours a day." He didn't respond. She walked to the edge of his desk, set the bag down carefully, and offered a small smile. "If you don't want it, that's fine. But you'll hurt Mr. Gianni's feelings. He swears his cranberry sauce is award-winning." Graham's eyes met hers for a moment, neutral, unreadable. Then he returned to his spreadsheet. Charlotte didn't wait for a thank you. She turned, closed the door behind her, and went back to her desk. Later that afternoon, when she returned to drop off a file, the bag was still there unopened, but when she came in the next morning, it was gone. She said nothing, and yet something between them, something invisible, had shifted. There were no warm exchanges or sudden friendliness, but there was a pause, now, when he handed her documents, a glance that lingered a second longer than it used to. Once, she caught him murmuring a quiet thank you when she handed him the updated project calendar, so soft she almost didn't hear it. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was something else, a kind of silent truce. On Tuesday morning of the following week, she arrived a little earlier than usual. The sky was still pale gray, and downtown Seattle hadn't quite woken up. She let herself in, as she always did, with the temporary badge clipped to her coat. She moved quietly through the outer office space and paused outside his door. It was cracked open. She didn't mean to look in, but something made her stop. Graham was seated at the far end of the room, not at his desk, but in the leather chair near the window. The early morning light cast a faint glow on the side of his face. In his hands, he held a sheet of paper, worn, folded at the corners, yellowed with time. Charlotte recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the kind only children had, large, slightly wobbly letters, drawn with care. There was a stick figure at the bottom, a sun in the corner, the words, "I love you, big brother." She didn't move. She barely breathed. Graham's shoulders were still, but his gaze was distant, not at the letter, but through it, through the glass, through time. There was something so profoundly alone about him in that moment that Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She stepped back before he noticed her, returning to her desk with quiet steps. She didn't mention what she saw. Not that day, not ever. But something inside her softened. The sharp edges of her impression of him dulled, just slightly. He was still exacting, still closed off, still moved like a man with a mission. But now she knew that, beneath the suit and the silence, there was a brother who had once been loved by a child who could no longer tell him so. She didn't ask, but she started to see the man, not the title. No one builds walls unless they've once been broken. It happened by accident, though. In hindsight, Charlotte would wonder if some discoveries are ever truly accidental. She had been asked to organize and digitize a backlog of files from the company's internal philanthropy branch. Graham had handed her a stack of folders without explanation, simply saying, "These need to be cataloged, make sure the older materials are archived properly. The files weren't confidential, at least not in the traditional sense. They were records of grants, research partnerships, community initiatives. Most of them read like standard corporate outreach scholarships, health awareness programs, early-stage trials for rare diseases. But one folder stood out. It was thinner, tucked between two bulkier reports, and paper-clipped rather than bound. The cover page read, Eleanor's Fund, Rare Disease Pediatric Initiative, established, 2014. Private contribution. Charlotte opened it gently. Inside was a single photograph, slightly faded. A young girl, no more than 9, stood grinning at the camera with her arms wrapped around the waist of a taller boy. Her hair was in pigtails, her smile unrestrained, joyful. The boy beside her, easily a teenager, looked embarrassed but indulgent. He wore a high school hoodie. His hand rested protectively on her shoulder. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was Graham. She stared at the photo for a long time, then glanced down at the paperwork clipped beneath it. Eleanor Lockridge, born 2001, diagnosed at age 8 with a rare autoimmune disorder, deceased 2013. The breath caught in Charlotte's throat. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The clinical focus of Lockridge Enterprises, the pace he kept, the silence he wore like armor. This wasn't just business. It was personal. Every long night, every report reviewed twice. It wasn't about control. It was about atonement. She placed the folder back, carefully, quietly, as though returning something sacred to its altar. After that day, Charlotte saw Graham differently, not less formidable, but more human. She didn't bring it up, not the photo, not the fund, but something shifted in the way she spoke to him. She softened her tone, asked questions with more curiosity than caution. To her surprise, he began to answer. It started with small things. One morning, as she handed him his schedule, she asked, "Do you ever take time away from this place?" He raised an eyebrow. "Is that a rhetorical question?" "Sort of," she said, smiling, sort of a challenge. He didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Later that week, she commented on a book resting on the corner of his shelf, an old hardback, spine cracked from use. "I didn't expect you to be a fan of Steinbeck," she said. Graham didn't look up from his tablet, but he replied, "My father read East of Eden out loud when I was 13, every night for a month." She paused, surprised. "That's a good memory," she said gently. "It's one of the few," he answered without bitterness. "Just fact." Each day after that, their interactions took on new shape, less like exchanges of duty, more like dialogue, a kind of cautious, unspoken trust, a rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both seemed to fall into. One afternoon, Charlotte knocked softly before entering his office. Graham sat at his desk, eyes focused on a dense financial report. A half-full mug of coffee sat forgotten by his elbow. He hadn't moved for over 2 hours. Charlotte stepped in, holding a document he'd requested, but she didn't hand it over right away. "You've been sitting like that since lunch," she said. "I'm working," he replied, not looking up. "I can see that." The room was quiet for a beat. Then she added, "Even a machine needs maintenance." That made him pause. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were tired, not red or bloodshot, just weary in the way a person becomes when they've carried something heavy for too long, without setting it down. He didn't answer right away. Charlotte didn't fill the silence. She simply placed the document on his desk, straightened the edge with her fingers, and offered a soft, steady look. For the first time since she had met him, Graham didn't look through her. He looked at her, as if seeing someone who not only observed the cracks in his marble shell, but respected them. The moment passed, and he returned to his report. But that night, long after the building had emptied and the lights had dimmed, Graham Lockridge sat in his office alone, staring at the words Charlotte had left him with. Even a machine needs maintenance. It echoed in his mind louder than any boardroom voice, more persistent than any investor memo. He rubbed the back of his neck, closed the report, and looked toward the hallway where her office light had been earlier. It was off now, but her presence lingered. He tried to focus, tried to return to the numbers, the margins, the language of logic, but for the first time in years, it didn't hold him. Graham found himself thinking of her even after she left the office. Sometimes, all it takes is one night to see someone with new eyes. Charlotte hadn't expected the invitation. It arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, printed on thick ivory paper embossed with gold lettering. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a misplaced document meant for someone else. But then she saw the note attached, written in Graham's unmistakably sharp, deliberate handwriting. Your presence is requested at the Lockridge Foundation Gala this Saturday. Formal attire will be provided. Transportation arranged. This is a professional function, but your company would be welcome. G.L. She stared at it for several minutes before she could even process the words. The gala. The biggest night of the year for Lockridge Enterprises. The room where million-dollar donations were pledged over crystal glasses and quiet nods. Where biotech deals were seated under chandeliers and the city's elite mingled like old friends. And somehow, she was invited. Charlotte wasn't sure what surprised her more, the invitation itself, or the careful, almost awkward wording Graham had chosen. Formal, arranged, professional, yet somehow still personal. By the time Saturday arrived, she was a bundle of nerves wrapped in a borrowed sense of composure. The dress had been delivered that morning, carefully packaged in a white garment bag with her name stitched on the hanger. It wasn't flashy, no sequins or plunging necklines, just a soft navy blue gown with delicate draping at the shoulders, simple lines that flattered her frame without demanding attention. The accompanying note simply read, "Understated elegance suits you." There was no signature, but she knew. At 6:45 p.m., a black car pulled up in front of her apartment building. The driver, an older gentleman named Henry, greeted her with a warm smile and called her Miss Hayes with the kind of respect that made her stand a little taller. Inside the car, she found a small velvet box. She hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won. Inside lay a pair of pearl earrings, luminous and classic. No note this time, just the quiet gesture of someone who noticed things without needing to say them aloud. The gala was held at the Grand Oak Pavilion, one of the oldest and most revered venues in Seattle. As the car pulled up, Charlotte saw lights cascading across the glass entryway, music floating faintly into the cool evening air, people milled about in tuxedos and gowns, laughter rising like champagne bubbles. She had never felt more out of place. And then she saw him. Graham was waiting just inside the doors, speaking with someone she didn't recognize. But the moment he saw her, he stopped mid-sentence. He looked startled, and then something softer passed over his face. Not admiration, exactly, something quieter, like he was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she reached him. Charlotte smiled, her nerves settling slightly. "You clean up all right yourself," she replied, trying to keep her voice light, though her heart was drumming against her ribs. The evening unfolded in a blur of soft lighting and polished conversation. Graham guided her through the room with a quiet ease that surprised her. He introduced her not as his secretary, but simply as Charlotte Hayes. She noticed the way he positioned himself slightly toward her in every interaction, creating a subtle but undeniable sense of alliance. Still, she kept her guard up until she arrived. Alexandra Kane. The name wasn't spoken aloud, but Charlotte recognized her from an old photo in one of the archived press releases back when Graham used to appear at events with a woman on his arm. Tall, blonde, and sculpted in that effortless way only wealth can sustain. Alexandra moved through the crowd like someone who'd never doubted her own importance. She approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Graham," she purred, brushing a kiss against his cheek. "How long has it been?" His posture stiffened slightly. "Alexandra? And this must be your new assistant." Charlotte offered a polite smile. "Charlotte Hayes. It's a pleasure. Alexandra's gaze flicked over her dress, the simple pearl earrings, the soft bun at the nape of her neck. It wasn't overt, but the message was clear. "Oh," Alexandra said with a tilt of her head. How refreshing. Graham always did have a soft spot for sincerity. The words hung in the air, dipped in honey and poison. A few nearby guests turned subtly, sensing tension. Charlotte didn't flinch. She met Alexandra's eyes and said, evenly, "And I've always had a soft spot for Grace, especially when it's genuine." The room went still for a beat. Alexandra's smile faltered, just slightly. Graham stepped closer to Charlotte, then not dramatically, but enough to place a steady hand on the small of her back. His fingers rested there, firm and quiet, a gesture of reassurance and ownership, and something gentler. Charlotte couldn't quite name. Alexandra's eyes flicked to that hand, then back to Charlotte. "Enjoy your evening," she said crisply, before disappearing into the crowd. Charlotte exhaled. Finally. Graham looked down at her, his hand still resting lightly against her back. "You handled that? Exceptionally." "She handed it to me on a silver platter," Charlotte replied, her voice soft. He chuckled, then turned serious. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not pretending." The rest of the evening passed more quietly. They danced once, though neither of them would have called it dancing. Exactly. Just a slow shuffle around the edges of the ballroom floor, her hand in his gaze lingering longer than it used to. When they returned to the car, neither of them spoke for a while, but the silence was comfortable now, full of things that didn't need to be said. As the city lights flickered across the windshield and the night wrapped around them like velvet, Charlotte leaned her head gently against the seat and let herself feel something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. It was supposed to be just a gala, but that night changed something unspoken between them. Trust is fragile. It doesn't shatter with a scream, but with a whisper behind closed doors. It was late, the kind of late where most lights in the building had already dimmed, leaving only the soft hum of servers and the occasional flicker of hallway bulbs that turned everything a shade more hollow. Charlotte hadn't meant to stay so long, but the quarterly report Graham had mentioned earlier sat unfinished on her screen, and she needed to get it right. It had been 2 weeks since the gala, 2 quiet, confusing weeks, where Graham oscillated between warm silences and cool professionalism, where he lingered longer in the doorway of her office, but never crossed it, where his eyes seemed to hold questions he hadn't yet found the courage or maybe the permission to ask. She hadn't pushed. She wasn't sure she wanted to push, because some things felt too delicate to name. That night, as she walked toward the main printer to retrieve a final set of notes, Charlotte passed the small conference room near Graham's corner office. The door was almost closed, but not quite, and it wasn't the voices that made her pause. It was her name, Charlotte Hayes. "She's been useful," came Graham's voice, low and composed. "Her presence softens the perception around me, especially after last quarter's fallout. There's been a noticeable uptick in internal morale, and from a public standpoint, it could be advantageous to align with someone more grounded." Charlotte froze. Useful. Advantageous. Align with words that, in any other context, might have sounded strategic detached, even admirable in their efficiency, but not like this. Not when the subject was her. The voice of another man responded. She didn't recognize it. Perhaps a media consultant. "You're saying we make it part of the narrative. Humanize the CEO, show vulnerability, build connection through relatability." There was a pause. Then Graham again. "She doesn't need to know the details. It's not like it's a real relationship." The printer behind her whirred, startling Charlotte like a slap. Paper spilled from the tray onto the floor, fluttering like startled birds. But the sound barely registered. Her ears were ringing. Her chest ached in that specific hollow way. Heartbreak creeps in, not through a dramatic blow, but through a quiet unraveling. It's not like it's a real relationship. Every lingering glance, every late-night conversation, Every moment at the gala where his hand rested gently, protectively, at the small of her back. Had it all been staged? A performance for shareholders and press releases, Charlotte backed away from the door, the carpet catching slightly under her heel. She didn't look inside. She didn't want to see his face, especially not if it was calm, calculating, composed. Her office felt too cold, too pristine. She moved on instinct, reaching for the notepad she always kept near the keyboard. She wrote only one sentence: I thought I was a person. Not a public relations tactic, no greeting, no signature. She placed it on his desk before she could lose her resolve. Her coat was still draped over her chair. She grabbed it without turning back. The elevator took an eternity to arrive, and when it did, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor with a hand that trembled. Seattle's night air was damp and quiet. She walked home, even though it was nearly midnight and the streets were nearly empty. Her heels clicked on the sidewalk like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence she never wanted to write. By the time she reached her apartment, the ache had turned to something more dangerous: doubt. Had she imagined it all? The kindness in his eyes when he looked at her, the gentle way he'd spoken after the gala, the pearls, the smile, the protection. Had it all been part of a plan, or worse? Had it started as a plan and she had been foolish enough to hope it became something else? Charlotte didn't cry. Not then, because this heartbreak wasn't a sharp pain. It was slow and quiet, a kind of grief that settled into the bones, whispering that once again she had let herself believe she mattered in a world built on transactions. Back at Lockridge Enterprises, the morning sun spilled across Graham's office in gold streaks. He arrived earlier than usual, a coffee in one hand, phone in the other. It was a routine morning until he looked toward her desk. It was empty, not just unoccupied, stripped, no notepad, no pencil jar, no cardigan draped across the back of the chair. Her mug with the fading World's Okayest secretary print was gone. A stillness settled in his chest. Then he saw the note on his desk. Just one line, handwritten in that calm, elegant script he'd come to recognize, even without looking. I thought I was a person, not a public relations tactic. The world tilted slightly. For the first time in years, Graham Lockridge felt something break inside, not from an external force, not from market losses or boardroom defeats, but from her absence. And for a man who had built his life around strategy, silence, and control, panic was not part of the plan. You don't always know what you had until it walks out the door in silence. The chair was still tucked neatly under the desk. Not pushed aside in haste, not abandoned in anger, just empty. There was something unnerving about its stillness. It was as though Charlotte had never been there, as though she had always been a ghost passing through polished floors and glass walls, too gentle for a world made of steel. But Graham Lockridge knew better. He stood in the hallway longer than he realized, his fingers gripping the folder he had meant to hand her that morning, the one labeled Confidential, Q3 Strategy. He had even circled a note inside it, a little scribble for her eyes. Only your feedback matters here, truly. But she wasn't there, and no one could tell him where she'd gone. Her email was deactivated, her desk phone rang unanswered, her cell he tried 3 times went straight to voicemail. The recorded voice that had once made him smile now felt like a closed door. By noon, the news had reached him officially. Charlotte Hayes had resigned, effective immediately. She had cited personal reasons. Nothing more, no follow-up, no negotiation, no goodbye. His assistant left a small white envelope on his desk that afternoon. Inside, folded once with painful precision, was the same notepad paper she had always used for his meeting, recaps and lunch reminders. But this time, there was only one sentence. I thought I mattered. I was wrong, no salutation, no name, and yet, it may as well have been carved into stone. He didn't attend the leadership meeting that day. Didn't respond to Jennifer Walsh's cautious knock when she came by to ask if everything was all right. Didn't answer the messages from his executive team, the investors, the press inquiry about the gala donation. Instead, Graham sat alone in his office as the daylight drained slowly from the sky. He didn't turn on the lights. The city glittered beyond the windows, unaware or perhaps uncaring of the storm building quietly behind his eyes. The last time he had felt this hollow, it was a hospital room, white walls, white sheets, beeping monitors that stopped too soon. His sister's hand had grown colder in his, and he had made a silent vow to never feel that deeply again. It hadn't worked. Then Alexandra, elegant, calculated, disarming. She'd taken his trust and traded it for a seat at another boardroom table. He had called that betrayal a lesson. He had told himself he was stronger for it. But now it was Charlotte's absence that undid him. Not because she had stormed out, not because she had raised her voice or exposed him in public. No, she had simply left. And in doing so, she had taken something with her that Graham couldn't quite name but felt everywhere. The small, steady hum of comfort when she walked past. The way she organized his world without making him feel managed. The gentle space she gave him to be human. Now, all of that was gone. He turned in his chair, facing the window. The glass reflected a man he barely recognized. Tie loosened, eyes shadowed, jaw clenched like he was holding back words he hadn't spoken in years. Charlotte had seen something in him. Not the title, not the money, him, and he had reduced her to a strategic asset. He had called it not a real relationship, because saying anything more would have made it true. And truth, he feared, came with risk. But what had he protected? Really? His reputation? His control? Or had he simply been running from the ache he now felt, echoing through every quiet room she used to walk through? The sun finally dipped beneath the skyline, and the office was bathed in blue-gray dusk. Still, he didn't turn on the lights. Some part of him thought maybe if he sat there long enough, he could will her back, that she might walk through the door again, her steps hesitant but forgiving, that she might give him a second chance he hadn't yet earned. But the hours passed, and she did not come. For the first time in a long while, Graham Lockridge felt like a child again, lost in a place too big, too cold, and too filled with shadows. He had built empires, but he didn't know how to ask for someone to stay, and that was what broke him. He stood at last, crossing to the coat stand. His movements were slow, unsure, unlike him. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he couldn't stay here, not with the ghost of her scent still faint on the air, not with the echo of her voice in his mind, saying, even a machine needs maintenance. Outside, the Seattle night had turned brisk, wind picking up along the sound. He stepped into it without a destination, but with one decision anchoring his every step, he was going to find her. And this time, he wouldn't bring strategy. He would bring truth. When a man who never speaks from the heart finally does, the world listens. The press room at Lockridge Enterprises had never been used for anything quite like this. It was where quarterly reports were announced, where earnings were dissected, and where polite applause followed every milestone the company achieved. But that morning, the atmosphere was different. The long oak table at the front was bare, no banners, no graphs, no projections, just a single microphone. Reporters filled every seat. The rest of the world tuned in through live streams, phones, and TV screens. Not because there was an earnings update, but because the man who never spoke from the heart had called a press conference and no one knew why. Graham stood just behind the curtain, staring down at the note in his pocket. He hadn't written a speech. He couldn't. Everything he had to say had already been felt. For days. He'd rehearsed numbers, phrases, carefully controlled language, and then he'd crumpled it all up and thrown it in the fire. Because this moment wasn't about control, it was about truth. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell into stillness. Not the kind made by silence, but the kind made by anticipation. He wore no tie, no lapel pin. His suit, though impeccable, looked like it had been put on without a second thought, but his eyes, storm gray and steady, held something new, unshielded grief. He approached the microphone slowly, as though every step cost something. and for a man used to commanding boardrooms, his voice came quieter than expected. "Thank you for coming. I'll keep this brief." A murmur passed through the room, but no one interrupted. He inhaled. "For the last 17 years, I've led Lockridge Enterprises through growth, failure, innovation, and recovery. We've created treatments, saved lives, and built something I thought was indestructible." He paused. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that building a life is not the same as building a company. There was no PowerPoint slide, no projection screen, just a man and his unvarnished truth. Effective immediately," he continued, "I am stepping down as CEO. My trusted colleague and COO, Natalie Reese, will assume leadership, and I have full confidence in her vision." Gasps broke the hush. Flashes popped as cameras documented the shift of an empire. But Graham didn't flinch. "I am not resigning due to scandal, or health, or investor pressure. I am resigning because I remembered what it means to be human." He stepped back from the mic for a moment, as if steadying himself. "A good company saves lives," he said, softer now. "But a good man must know how to live his own." In a quiet living room on the north side of Seattle, Charlotte Hayes sat on a modest couch, knees tucked under her, a chipped coffee mug cooling in her hands. She hadn't meant to watch. She told herself she wouldn't. But when the live stream link found its way into her inbox from an unknown sender, curiosity got the better of her. Now, she couldn't look away. He looked different. Not broken but real, worn down but unguarded. When he spoke the next words, her breath caught in her throat. "There is one more thing," he said. His eyes scanned the room, not searching for approval, but for courage. "I hurt someone. Someone who reminded me what it means to feel again, to listen, to show up." He swallowed. "I let fear speak louder than the truth, and I lost something I didn't know I needed until it was gone." The reporters didn't speak. The air had shifted. Even the harsh fluorescent lights seemed to soften for a moment. "This person may never forgive me," Graham said, looking not at the camera, but through it. "But if she's watching, I hope she knows I see her now. Not as an employee, not as a strategy, but as the one thing I never learned how to protect, because I'd forgotten what it meant to love anything that couldn't be quantified." Back in her living room, Charlotte didn't realize she was crying until a tear slid down her cheek and landed in her cup of coffee. Her heart beat so loud, it almost drowned out his voice. "Almost. That's all," he finished quietly. "Thank you." He stepped back, leaving the silence to speak for him. Cameras flashed again. The room stirred, but he didn't wait for questions. He turned and walked off stage, not like a man defeated, but like a man unburdened. Charlotte set the mug down slowly. Her fingers trembled. She didn't know what she expected from him. A call, a message, a clean explanation, but not this. Not live, not raw, not true. The man who had once reduced emotion to liability had now laid his entire heart bare for the world to see. And somehow, only one person in the world needed to hear it. Her. That night. As rain misted against the windows and the world speculated on corporate motives, Charlotte sat quietly, replaying his words. She didn't pick up the phone. Not yet, but for the first time since she walked away, she whispered something into the stillness of her apartment. Maybe, not all apologies are spoken. Some are written tucked inside the pages of what you once shared. It arrived on a Wednesday morning, just as the fog was beginning to lift off the streets and the world felt caught between seasons, neither the chill of winter nor the bloom of spring. A small package, plain brown paper, no note on the outside, just her name, written in ink, in handwriting she somehow already recognized. Charlotte stared at it for a moment longer than she needed to. Her hands, though steady, felt strangely weightless as she peeled back the wrapping. Inside was a book, not a new one. The spine was gently worn, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges. It was The Secret Life of Trees, the same book she'd mentioned in passing one late afternoon, long before things had started unraveling. "I used to read this with my mom," she had told him once. She believed trees could feel when we spoke kindly to them. At the time, Graham had only nodded. He hadn't said much, but apparently he had listened and remembered. Charlotte opened the book slowly. A single sheet of paper fell out and landed in her lap. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten. His handwriting wasn't elegant, but it was deliberate. Every curve of every letter looked as though it had been written with care, and maybe a little fear. Charlotte, I thought about sending an email. Easier, faster, but somehow it didn't feel right. You once told me words feel heavier when we have to write them down. So, here they are. You were never a strategy or a solution. You were the first person in years who didn't treat me like a broken machine or a paycheck. And I didn't know what to do with that. I hurt you, not by accident, but by reflex. Because somewhere along the way, I trained myself to see feelings as distractions and vulnerability as weakness. You reminded me that none of that is true. This isn't a request or an expectation. It's just what's left when the noise fades truth. If you choose to walk back into my life, I promise to walk beside you, not ahead of you. But if you don't, thank you for waking me up. With more sincerity than I've ever known how to give, Graham Charlotte didn't move for a long time. The letter sat open in her lap. The book rested against her chest. The room around her faded into stillness, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a single car driving past her window. She read the letter again and again. Not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because part of her couldn't believe it was real. There were no grand promises, no begging, no declarations designed to win her back. Just honesty. And for a man who once lived behind marble walls and mirrored glass, it was the most radical thing he could have offered. It wasn't just that he had changed. It was that he wanted to keep changing, and not for the company, not for the world, but for her. Charlotte closed the book slowly, fingers brushing the spine like she was tucking a memory away for safekeeping. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stood, reached for her coat, and without hesitation, slipped the book into her bag. She didn't call, she didn't text, she just walked out the door and turned left toward the only bookstore they both loved, the one with creaky floors, warm lamps, and a little coffee stand in the back that served the worst espresso, but somehow always felt like comfort. The place where their first real conversation hadn't been about a meeting or a deadline, but about the kinds of stories that make you feel less alone in the world. She didn't know if he'd be there. She didn't know what she'd say, but for the first time in a long time, her steps felt light, like the burden she'd been carrying had finally loosened its grip. Outside, the sky remained overcast, but the clouds had softened, the kind of gray that promises something new, not something ending. Healing doesn't come all at once, but sometimes all it takes is a hand reaching back. The bell above the bookstore door gave a soft chime. Charlotte stepped inside, the familiar scent of old paper and roasted coffee wrapping around her like a childhood blanket. The wooden floor creaked beneath her boots, same as it always had. For a second, she simply stood there, letting the warmth of the place soak into her skin. And then, she saw him. Graham stood near the back, by the table they had once browsed together, though they hadn't really been looking for books that day. His fingers grazed the edges of a spine, but his eyes were already on her. He didn't speak, neither did she. Some moments are too delicate for words, too full. Charlotte took a slow step forward, then another, until she stood before him. They looked at each other for a long time, eyes meeting across the space between everything that had broken and everything that still remained. Graham's face had softened, the guarded lines around his mouth, the tension in his jaw gone. He looked human, real, tired, maybe, but open. He didn't reach for her, not at first. It was Charlotte who placed a hand gently on his arm, a touch, quiet and warm, like forgiveness without needing to name it. And only then, he leaned in, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture that said more than any apology ever could. When they pulled apart, he smiled, just a little. She smiled back, and then, like the first leaves after a long winter, something began again. 6 months later, Seattle wore early autumn like a cozy shawl. The leaves along Green Lake Avenue had begun to crisp and curl, rust-colored and golden. The air held the first whispers of cold. Inside a modest brick building, tucked between a bakery and a thrift store, Charlotte stood by a corkboard, pinning a flyer with careful fingers. It read, "Career Readiness Workshop for Women, Returning to the Workforce." Behind her, laughter drifted from the common room. A group of women, some in their 50s, others older, were swapping stories over lukewarm tea and store-brand cookies. They had come in anxious, unsure. Now, they spoke like friends. Charlotte stepped back, brushing her hands on her skirt. Her work wasn't glamorous. It didn't make headlines. But it mattered. And not just to others, to her. Every woman who walked through that door reminded her of herself, standing on the edge of something uncertain, choosing hope anyway. Across town, Graham sat in a folding chair outside a mobile clinic. It was one of 4 he had helped fund through his new public health initiative. They offered basic screenings, vaccinations, mental health support for people who didn't have the time or money for polished hospitals. A little boy ran past, chasing a paper airplane. His mother mouthed a thank you as she received her prescriptions. Graham nodded gently. No press, no cameras, just work that made him feel whole. He'd traded boardrooms for waiting rooms, power for purpose. It wasn't that he'd lost who he was. He'd just finally stopped running from the part of himself that felt things. They still lived separately, still kept their lives distinct. But every evening, like clockwork, he walked to her apartment with a takeout bag in hand. Some nights it was Thai, other nights just soup and bread. They'd sit on the couch, sharing stories from their day, or sometimes sharing silence. Not the strained kind, the comfortable kind, the kind of silence that says, "I see you." And you don't have to be anything more than exactly who you are. One Friday evening, as they walked side by side through Green Lake Park, Graham paused by the bench beneath a sycamore tree. It was the same one they'd passed that first week, back when Charlotte was still just the temp secretary and he was still too busy to notice the people in his own building. Now, they sat there together, no rush, no titles, no distance. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their fingers laced together slowly, like 2 stories that had once veered in opposite directions, finally finding the same page. Charlotte leaned her head against his shoulder. No grand declarations, no music swelling in the background, just wind in the leaves, just 2 people moving forward. She was just a secretary, until she challenged her billionaire boss. But what she really did was challenge the idea that a life must be built only on success. She reminded him that being human meant being vulnerable, that pain and hope can share the same heart, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. Not because you're weak, but because you believe people can change. Because you believe love, in its quietest form, is enough. And Graham, he learned that the only kind of power worth holding on to is the kind that makes room for someone else beside you. Someone who calls you back to yourself. Someone who holds the mirror gently and says, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be here." And so they sat. Not at the end of their story, but right in the middle of a new chapter, side by side, hands entwined, learning, together, how to walk forward. As we grow older, we learn that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's simply choosing to show up, especially when your world feels like it's falling apart. Charlotte Hayes didn't have power, wealth, or prestige. But she had grace, quiet dignity, and the courage to stand her ground in a world that often overlooks women like her. Graham Lockridge had everything money could buy, but nothing that could truly hold him in the dark. This story reminds us that healing often begins not with grand gestures, but with a single moment of being seen and letting someone else see us. Flaws and all, we are never too old to start again, never too broken to find love, and never too far gone to change the story we're in. So, If you're carrying old grief, quiet regrets, or a heart that's been closed for too long, maybe it's time to soften, to open, even just a little, because sometimes the smallest acts of courage like kindness or honesty can change the entire course of a life. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing for more stories that remind us what really matters. Your support helps this channel grow and brings more gentle, healing stories into the world. From my heart to yours. Until next time.